Dealings with the Dead, number 23. Few things can be imagined more thoroughly revolting and absurd than the vengeance of the living, riding among the ashes of the dead, rudely rolling the stone away from the door of the sepulchre, entering the narrow houses of the unresisting vi et armis with the pickaxe and the crowbar, and scattering to the winds the poor senseless remains of those who were consigned to their resting places, with all the honors of a former age. This, were it not awful, would be eminently ridiculous, for the excavation of such post hominis revenge. The French nation has the precedence of every other, civilized and savage. Frenchmen, if not, through all time, from the days of Pharamond to the present, remarkably zealous of good works, are clearly a peculiar people. The history of the world furnishes no parallel with that preposterous crusade carried on by that people in 1794 against the dead bodies of kings and princes, saints and martyrs. This war upon dead men's bones was not projected and executed by the rabble on the impulse of the moment. We see similar with the Black Lives Matter Antifa thing, right? They try to make it sound like it's a grassroots movement when it was paid off by one of the richest people in the world. A former deliberate decree of the convention commanded that the tombs should be destroyed, and they were destroyed, and their contents scattered to the winds accordingly. Talk not of all that is furious and fantastical in the conduct of monkeys and maniacs. A nation of chimpanzees would have acted with more dignity and discretion. A colony of grinning baboons, as Shakespeare calls them, bent upon liberty, equality, and fraternity, might have dethroned some tyrannical orangutan who had carried out matters with too high a hand and extorted too many coconuts for the support of the civil list. But after having cut off his head, it is not to be believed that they would have gone about stretching up the ashes of the ancestors and wreaking their vengeance upon those unoffending relics. This miserable onslaught upon the dead began immediately after December 20th, 1794. The new worship commenced on that day, and the goddess of reason then, for the first time, presented herself to the people in the person of the celebrated actress, Mademoiselle Maillard. Saint Genevieve, the patroness of the city of Paris, died in 512, and her remains were subsequently transferred to the church which bears her name, and which was erected by Clovis in 517. The executive agents of the National Convention commenced their legalized fooleries upon the ashes of this poor old saint. These French gentlemen, the politest nation upon earth, without the slightest regard for decency or sanctification or common sense, dug up Madame Genevieve's coffin, and to aggravate the indignity, dragged the old lady's remains to the place of public execution, the place, the grave, and having burnt them there, scattered the ashes to the winds. The gates of bronze presented by Charlemagne to the church of Saint Denis were broken to pieces. Pepin, the sire of Charlemagne and the son of Charles Martel, was buried there in 768. Nothing remained to Pepin but a handful of ashes, which was served in a similar manner. It is stated by Lamartine at the heads of Marshal Turenne, Duquesselin, Louis XII, and Francis I were rolled about the pavement. Scepters, crowns, and cuirassiers were trampled underfoot, and the shouts of the operatives were heard. When the blows of the axe broke through some regal coffin, and the royal bones were thrown out, to be treated with senseless insult. Hugh Capet, Philip the Bold, and Philip the Handsome were buried beneath the choir. The ruthless hands of these modern vandals tore from the corpses those garments of the grave in which they had reposed for centuries, and threw the relics upon the beds of quicklime. Henry IV fell by the hands of Ravaillac, the assassin, May 14th, 1610. His body was carefully embalmed by Italians. When taken from the coffin, the lineaments of the face fully corresponded with the numerous representations transmitted by the hands of painters and statuaries. That cherished and perfumed beard expanded as if it had just then received the last manipulation of the frisure. The marks were perfectly visible upon the breast, indicating the first and second thrust of Ravillac's stiletto. The popularity of this monarch protected his remains, though for a brief space. He was frank, brave, and humane. For 2 days, all that remained of this idol of the people was exhibited to public view. The exhumed king was placed at the foot of the altar, and a countless multitude passed in mute procession around these favored relics. This gave umbrage to Javogues, a member of the convention. He denounced this partially and rallied against the memory of Henry le Grand. The multitude, impressible by the slightest impulse, hurled the dead monarch into the common fosse of quicklime and corruption. Execrating under the influence of a few feverish words from the lips of a Republican savage, the memory and the remains of one cherished by their predecessors for nearly 300 years. A similar fate awaited his son and grandson, Louis XIII and XIV. The vault of the Bourbons was thoroughly ransacked in the same spirit of desolation. Queens, dauphinesses, and princesses, says the historian of the Girondists, were carried away in arms full by the laborers to be cast into the trench and consumed by quicklime. In the vault of Charles V, surnamed the Wise, besides the corpse were found a hand of justice and a golden crown. In the coffin of his wife, Jean of Bourbon, were her spindles and marriage rings. These relics were thrown into the ditch. The corpses, not the articles of gold, however, debased by their juxtaposition. The French gentleman, it may be affirmed, as of Madame Gilpin, though on pleasure she was bent, she had a frugal mind. An economy, perfectly grotesque, mingled with an unmanly desecration. Even the lead was scraped together from these coffins and converted into balls. In the vault of Valois, no bodies were discovered. The people were very desirous of showing some tokens of their wrath upon the poor carcass of Louis XI, but it could not be found. Abbess, heroes, ministers of the state were indiscriminately cast into the fosse. Upon the exhumation of Dagobert I and his queen, Mathilde, who had been buried 1,200 years, her skeleton was found without a head. Such is said to have been the case of several other skeletons of the queens of France. In one of the upper lofts of the cabinet of natural history of the Jardin des Plantes, among stuffed beasts and birds surrounded by mixed and manifold rubbish covered with dust, there lay a case or package, unexamined and unnoticed for 9 long years. This envelope contained the mortal remains of Marechal of France, the hero of an 100 battles, of no other than Henry de la Tour, Viscount de Turenne. He was killed by a cannonball on July 27, 1675, at the age of 64. All France lamented the death of this great man. The administration of all Europe followed him to the grave. Courage, modesty, generosity, science have embalmed his memory. The king, Louis le Grand, ordered a solemn service to be performed for the Marechal de Turenne in the Catholic Church at Paris. As for the first prince of the blood, and that his remains should be interred in the Abbey of Saint Denis, the burial place of the royal personages of France, where the cardinal, his nephew, raised a splendid mausoleum to his memory. So much for glory, and what then? In 1794, the remains of this great man were upon the point of being cast in the common fosse by the agents of the Convention, when some less rabid than the rest smuggled them away, and for security conveyed them to the lumber room of the Cabinet of Natural History of the Jardin des Plantes. Having reposed 9 years in state, peradventure between a dilapidated kangaroo and a cast-off opossum, these remains of the great Turenne were at length committed in a quiet way to the military tomb of the Invalids. And that we don't just resign ourselves to senseless destruction. It's one thing making room. It's another thing desecrating. And if they don't want those, staffs and all that stuff in that condition, okay, then use them. But there's a question about archaeologists too, right?